Good morning, everyone, both in the auditorium and also online. So this breakout session is on election interference, specifically entitled Emerging Forms of Propaganda in Elections. My name is Paolo Tamase. I am an assistant professor in the University of the Philippines College of Law, and I will be moderating this panel. It's always glad to be back. Every visit to New Haven is a homecoming, but it's especially interesting this morning because we have an exciting panel this morning with three great papers. Our first panelist is Carlos Affonso Souza. He is a professor in the Rio de Janeiro State University in Brazil. Our second panelist is Grant Fergusson of the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC. And the third is Sinta of the University of Padjadjaran in Indonesia, who is also a professor in that institution. If I can invite our speakers to present for 15 minutes, we have a timer who will cue when the time is almost up. Then after all of the speakers get to present their papers, we'll proceed to questions and answers and comments, both from myself as moderator as well as the rest of the audience. So if I can invite Carlos to present for the first paper for this morning.
All right, so good morning, everyone. Let me just say it's a pleasure to be here, especially among friends for this very interesting conversation that we have ahead of us, addressing issues of disinformation and elections under this little bit broader banner of online propaganda. So my talk today, it's a brief outlook on a paper I'm working on, focusing on the challenges that Brazil is going through in coming up with a regulation about digital platforms, and especially how this whole conversation about how to regulate, what is the best solution for that, comes out of the moment in which we had a very dramatic event in Brazil, which was the storming of Brasilia, the capital of Brazil, of public buildings being stormed by 4,000 people, an event that raised all sorts of comparisons with the events that happened here in the US on January 6th. We had our January 8th. So for us to understand a little bit where we are now in Brazil, I think it's important to look back to the 4 years of Bolsonaro administrations and understand a little bit the struggles and the way that we could frame those 4 years under the banner of digital propaganda. So what I would suggest is that what we could see in the Brazilian example is that there are three elements that we can see on how Bolsonaro ended up deploying a way to communicate and to articulate something that we could call digital propaganda. And those three elements would be, first of all, choose an antagonist. And that antagonist will be the Supreme Court in Brazil. Second, challenge the way in which content moderation happens on social media. And that was very prominent during the COVID pandemic. And third, and that's the focus of our panel, challenging electoral integrity in Brazil. So those three elements were represented quite clearly on the way in which things developed in Brazil. So the first element, which was choosing an antagonist. So the Supreme Court in Brazil served as an antagonist to the way in which the president delivered his activities. And this ended up leading to situations in which on public demonstrations, the president ended up very directly attacking the Supreme Court, saying, for instance, that he was not willing to comply with the judicial orders at some point, and even pardoning a congressman that has created a live broadcasting attacking justices of the Brazilian Supreme Court. So that's one first element of this digital propaganda agenda, which is selecting an antagonist, selecting an opponent as a way to mobilize supporters, and for the Brazilian purpose, that was the Supreme Court. A second element is challenging how content moderation happens. And Bolsonaro very prominently was this person that went against scientifically proven methods of fighting the COVID pandemic, being against vaccination, against the usage of masks, flirting with the idea, joking with the idea that people could turn into crocodiles if they took the shots, the vaccinations to fight the pandemic. So that led to a lot of the content that the president put up online to be content moderated on platforms, and that creates a lot of discussions about how politicians could frame the issue of content moderation as another element for a digital propaganda agenda. And the third one was the challenging of the electoral system in Brazil. So those three elements end up creating the situation in which Brazil ended up going through a moment in which, right after the elections that we had in 2022, the supporters of the former president end up creating roadblocks throughout the country, trying to stop the country, stop the economy at that time. And also they created encampments in front of the army barracks, of the army headquarters, in order to claim for some sort of military intervention in the country. So that all created the context in which on January 8th of 2023, there was the storming of Brasilia. So the paper that I'm working on is called The Storm After the Storm, because it ended up working around the term in English, because to storm might be to storm a building, but the storm might also be, well, an actual storm. And what we're having right now in Brazil is going through a second storm, which is, how do we deal with this situation? After this happened, the storming of Brasilia came to a closure. But how do we deal with the discussion about the role of technology in this whole scenario? So right now in Brazil, we're going through a conversation, a dialogue of different alternatives. So from one side, we have in the National Congress a debate of a bill of law that could tackle the way in which social media are regulated. And one academic question that for me is super interesting is the fact that Brazil already has a legislation on the internet. That's the so-called Brazil Internet Bill of Rights that was created back in 2014. And now we're seeing, not only in Brazil, but elsewhere, this almost like a second generation of internet laws. They are like deeply moved by issues concerning the fights against disinformation and how to tackle the regulation of very large online platforms. So it's interesting to understand how this, such to say, new generation of internet laws that tends to focus on more granular elements, such as transparency report, rules for content moderation, systemic risks, or risk analysis, how that set of new laws, they interplay with, well, previous set of laws that we had back in early 2010s. So that's a very interesting, I think, academic research that we're going through. But just to give an example on how the dialogue in Brazil is moving forward, we have this discussion right now in the Congress. We had the executive branch coming into play as well, because last year Brazil went through a moment in which there was a lot of tension, of violence in the schools in the country. So the executive branch ended up publishing an ordinance that create all different sets of obligations for online platforms in Brazil. And of course, we need to take a special look on how the judiciary will play a role in this discussion. And in Brazil right now, we have some pending decisions in the Brazilian Supreme Court that might shape the regulation of internet in Brazil in a different lens. And one thing that I would like to bring to our discussion here is that since we still in Brazil, we don't have a law approved in the Congress, there are pending decisions in the Supreme Court. This stalemate scenario end up creating the conditions for a new power to arise, and this power is the electoral court. So Brazil is unique in this situation because we do have a specific body, which is the electoral court, spearheaded by the Superior Electoral Court, that handles the elections in the country. And elections in Brazil, they happen twice every 2 years. So that means that every 2 years, we have this electoral court looking into the electoral moment and the state of arts of technology and coming up with new regulation about how internet and digital platforms will need to comply with new set of rules for elections. So that's a very interesting scenario because as we have this stalemate right now in Brazil, that means that if we do not have a new law, if there are decisions pending in the Supreme Court, by the end of the day, the de facto regulator of technology in Brazil has been the electoral court. And for this election, for this year, for instance, the electoral court has issued a resolution saying that digital platforms will need to monitor and take down content that are hate speech, anti-democratic, and if they fail to do so, they may be sanctioned. So that's a clear departure from our current legislation in Brazil concerning the liability of internet platforms. But it's interesting because it shows how elections are this special moment in which a lot of is in play. But how do we tackle the situation in which an ordinance or a regulation creates different set of rules than from those that you have on federal law? So I will, coming up to the ending of my presentation, and trying to suggest some elements that might be interesting for us to take a look on this, trying to create a framework for digital propaganda with a special focus on the majority world. So those elements I'm bringing out of the Brazilian experience, but I think friends from other countries will see connections on your local domestic context. So the first one is, it was really peculiar to see how in the previous administration, the judiciary power, and especially the Supreme Court, was selected as a main antagonist. And we could argue that having the judiciary as the antagonist for a digital propaganda agenda is a low-hanging fruit for all the obvious reasons. So first of all, when you criticize how the judiciary might move forward to restrict the way in which the president acts, you can trigger the discussion about the separation of power and saying that the judiciary is crossing the line, that the judiciary is trying to meddle with actions that are the attribution of the executive power. And as Bolsonaro quite usually said in Brazil, the judiciary is going way over the 4 lines of the Constitution. And of course, the 4 lines here, it's a soccer analysis or metaphor, as you can imagine, thinking about a soccer field, a football field, and you playing outside of the lines of this football field. The second one is usually justices, Supreme Court justices, they will serve for life or for a longer period of time. So that ends up creating the incentives for you to portray them as out of touch, or being a group that represents the establishment, represents the system, and that the president represents the change, represents something else. And in addition to that, well, we know law itself might be an arcane language, might be alienating. So the way in which court decides, the way in which decisions are written, that of course can end up not only inviting, but being something that is strange to the general public. And just to conclude, not only thinking about the judiciary, but thinking about other elements and this creation of a digital propaganda agenda, I think content moderation and social media governance is another issue that it's clearly in the spotlight because, first of all, most of the social media companies, they are not local. So you can easily claim that this is some sort of domestic, this is some sort of a foreign interference in domestic affairs. And that's something that every president from the majority world could play along and say that this is either US or China meddling with the domestic affairs. There's a practical challenge because even in some of those countries, you do have offices of those social media companies. Those offices will not be entitled to take decisions on content moderating the accounts of a president or an important authority. That will need to scale up to headquarters that will be in different country, different time zones. So the ability to moderate content of a president, of a politician, that might not be as quick as if that happened, for instance, in the US. And as of course we know, automatized content moderation in different language than English face all sorts of problems. And of course, that could serve, that could create an entry point for a debate and pinpointing some failures to regularly content moderate to say, hey, that's a problem. I'll just conclude saying that when we look into elections, there is one additional element that I think it's really important because as we move to elections that are increasingly digital, increasingly using electronic voting machines or ways in which we bring technology in the way that we vote, that will, of course, foster, triggers, and facilitates the way in which theories, misconceptions about the technology itself might play an important role in how people understand how the election end up happening in the first place. So, of course, in Brazil, that plays an important role because Brazil is like, I want to say 100%, but a good chunk of the Brazilian election goes through electronic voting machines. So that creates a space for all sorts of conspiracy theories and unfunded claims about electoral fraud to happen in the country. I will just stop here. Those are just a couple of elements for us to play along in our conversation about digital propaganda and elections. And I hope that the Brazilian example can be a useful example for us to understand how digital propaganda moves forward, and especially what are the peculiarities when we look into countries of the majority world. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Carlos. I think we'll reserve the time later for questions. So if we can have Grant to present his paper.
All right. It will be difficult to follow that up, but hello, everybody. My name is Grant Fergusson. I'm a lawyer at the Electronic Privacy Information Center, or EPIC for short. We're actually a legal advocacy center in DC, so I'm one of the few non-academics at the conference, hoping to share a bit of a practical example of how new technologies are actively impacting elections today, at least in the United States. Here, the example is a lot of the burgeoning AI technologies. Now, what exactly do we mean when we talk about AI election harms? It covers three main categories. One is understanding what exactly is happening. What are the functions of these new technologies that are impacting how we handle election misinformation, how we handle election integrity, how campaigns are run? Second is understanding a bit why this is difficult for us to address with existing election and democracy legal regimes. And the third is understanding, at least in the US context, what's currently being done as hopefully one example of what to do or what not to do in the global context. I'm going to dig a little bit into the technology, but you don't need a technical background to understand any of this. I'm going to try and make this very approachable. So first, before we jump into the harms, what do I mean when I talk about AI in this context? I'm just discussing two related examples. One is generative AI technologies. We're seeing this burgeoning of text, audio, and video that is being generated by artificial systems, often trained off of any range of commercial or consumer data. And the second is a simpler form of algorithm that we've seen for years in the online platform context. Algorithms used to recommend content, rank content, sort content, and of course, provide content when you search for it. Now, the harms come in several different forms, and I'm going to be focusing on the ways that technology is creating these harms and then applying it to the election context. The first and most obvious example is the ways that people can use these technologies to scam, manipulate, or disinform people for their own personal gain. These are things like robocalls and fake campaigns that may not actually have anything to do with the actual elections happening, but are ways of, you still can't hear? I'll go even closer, are ways for us to understand the election is not only a really ripe opportunity to manipulate political and democratic discourse, but also a way to manipulate people for other ends as well. So understanding the election not only in its own vacuum, but in the context of everything else going on. Elections are one of several opportunities to really prey on vulnerable populations. And this is a huge issue that we're seeing already play out in the US with voice cloning technology pretending to be either local politicians or election officials, as well as fake campaigns asking you to donate to a cause via a text, which may bring you to a scammer's website. Second is what many of the conference attendees here are calling propaganda. We're calling it misinformation or disinformation here, although I understand from the plenary that is probably a limited term. These are talking about the ways that AI is either intentionally or negligently causing disinformation to spread. One, in the negligent sense, is this term known as an AI hallucination. Often when we talk about generative AI technologies like ChatGPT or DALL-E, we think that they are going to provide some form of accurate information. In fact, that is not true at all. In several instances that we've already recorded, and increasingly so today, these technologies tend to produce things called hallucinations, which seem very, very real. They have correct syntax and grammar, but they come from nowhere, in part because these are, in a sense, stochastic parrots. They are providing something that seems correct, but is not actually substantively truthful. Second is just the ways that these technologies are facilitating or expediting the creation of misinformation and disinformation, where it might take a coordinated effort by a foreign government to create a digital campaign that will spread online maybe a week or so to really understand this. You can now very rapidly create convincing material in seconds using GPT. And you can create related deepfake videos and audio to correspond with that also very quickly. So it's not only in the fact that it is changing the way that we are creating content, but it's also expediting existing forms of propaganda and providing the tools to do it quicker, faster, and more cheaply. Third is cybersecurity threats. Here in the US, there's been a lot of focus on voter rolls, understanding who is voting, who is registered to vote, and in fact, pointing the finger at many people to say that they should not be voting. Cybersecurity in the AI context is pointing at the training data that these systems are using to understand who the voting rules are actually, what the voting rules are, and understanding who they can actually target more effectively. And then lastly is this concept called enshittification. It's a term coined by Cory Doctorow to broadly define the eventual and unavoidable degradation of many once reliable digital technologies and services. Here in the AI context, we're discussing the growing percentage of content online that is AI generated, that is often false, misleading, or otherwise just poor in quality. That not only makes it difficult to understand when content is factual, it's actually making it more difficult to even find that content. There is a sea of AI-generated content out there, at least in the US and English-speaking world. And this is a kind of large and looming problem as we try to grapple with propaganda, content moderation, and the dissemination of factual and important information. The world is only so big, and so much of this is being filled with some low-quality AI content. Now, what exactly does this mean for the election space, at least in the US? We highlight two main issues that are huge problems for active political work happening right now to address this issue. First is just the mere fact of anonymous creation and dissemination of content. While the plenary discussion earlier today discussed a lot of very formal disinformation and propaganda campaigns, there are also several propaganda campaigns that are happening informally from people online who want to boost conspiracy theories, share their own conspiracy theories, just troll the internet. And it's very difficult to actually identify people to enforce election laws against, as well as a whole range of other laws around content and speech. The second is a broader issue around amplification. As the plenary session this morning discussed it briefly, the harm, the impact of election disinformation and propaganda isn't in its mere creation. If you don't get attention on it, if you don't have a voice or a platform to spread that information, the impact goes nowhere. So there is a major concern in the US around how we tamp down on the ways that this content is being amplified and how this content can reemerge and continue to amplify even after it's been taken down once from other users or new communities that find it from other websites. In the US, for example, we have a fairly robust First Amendment free speech and platform liability regime that makes it very difficult for us to go after online platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter directly for managing and moderating this content. This is a kind of large and burgeoning issue that raises a lot of enforcement hurdles for the US actors at play. Now, who are these actors? There are several. We have a non-exhaustive list in the paper, but I'll very quickly mention four main buckets. One, as is true in many cases, Congress and legislation is a way forward, but it isn't the only way. Here in the US, Congress can actually put in campaign ethics rules for its current members, and several different House and Senate committees can conduct investigations, hold hearings, and suggest policy reforms in a more informal sense. We also have a very robust administrative state with formal agencies that have specific rulemaking and enforcement authority. Some of them have powers that they can actually apply to this space. For example, the FEC has specific campaign regulations around campaign misrepresentations that they could clarify extends to several AI-generated content. We can add additional prosecutorial and enforcement pressure on both platforms and AI developers to try to tamp down on the generation of content that has an election element to it. We can increase the dissemination of factual and truthful information. And we can also initiate several different rulemakings, as has currently been the case in the US, to try to tamp down on AI as a specific vector for propaganda and disinformation. For example, the Federal Communications Commission here in the US recently initiated a rule that would be banning AI robocalls for political purposes. Whether or not that is able to be enforced with the gaps we've discussed earlier is still a question to be discussed. Lastly, we have press in the public and AI developers and platforms. We've mentioned this a bit at the plenary discussion, but this is a battle of information and public discourse. And so bringing a lot of these issues to light, inoculating people against very convincing AI disinformation is a very valuable tool in our toolbox. It's not a perfect tool, but it is one. And lastly, AI developers and platforms have a very large role to play in this space. We are not talking to each other in person nearly as much as we do online these days. And so these intermediaries, these speech intermediaries, have a very important role to play in understanding how this election discourse is happening on their own platforms. There are several specific content-focused provisions in bills and regulations and political speeches that haven't gone very far because we have a robust platform liability law in the US, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. But there's a lot more that I think platforms can do. There are several design choices that platforms make that incentivize the amplification of polarizing or harmful content. There are design decisions they make in their user face to engage people in ways that may be hurtful for actual dissemination of information, of deliberation and public discourse in the way that we would expect in a democratic government. And there are so many other things in the paper that I did not have time to discuss, but I see I'm running low on time. So I want to raise a few kind of key questions from our paper that I'm hoping that we can discuss more fully in the global context during today's panel. One is that despite a lot of efforts, both in the US and abroad, on tamping down on the role of AI in propaganda and disinformation, key gaps still remain. It's hard to enforce against many of these companies and these individual users sharing and creating content. And it's also hard to find a durable solution, one that is effective even as the technologies may change over time. Second, the US likes to put itself out there as being a front and center force against political disinformation, but we are not winning the war. Here in the US, there is rampant political disinformation and conspiracy theories that platforms have tried and failed to take down. And so would love to broaden the discussion about what things have worked in other countries to train practitioners, regulators, and policymakers on effective tools. And then lastly, what things could we do differently? As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm a practitioner, a lawyer, not an academic. We are filing complaints, amicus briefs, talking to legislators. Are there techniques, strategies, advocacy methods that we can do to better push effective, durable policy choices, at least in the US? And with that, I will end it here a little early and hand it back.
Thank you, Grant. And on that note, it has been a pleasure listening to the three of you this morning, as well as listening to our questions. Can we give our three speakers a big round of applause? So,